Have you ever faced a problem, maybe something complex, and just thought, okay, where do I even start?
Oh, absolutely. That feeling of staring at all the pieces, but not knowing how to put them together. Structure is everything.
That's exactly what we're tackling in this deep dive.
Mm.
We've got some material here on a specific legal question. It's about this thing called lifting the corporate veil.
Right.
But the real mission today isn't just the law itself. It's about using this example to walk through a structured way to analyze a situation,
Mhm.
apply the rules, learning how to break down a problem like a legal expert might.
It's a great way to learn the method. And
Yeah.
the core concepts here are fascinating. This idea that a company is its own person, legally speaking.
And crucially, when that idea gets set aside.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's get into that core principle. The materials start with the absolute foundation of company law. What's that?
It's called the Doctrine of Separate Legal Personality, or SLP.
Yeah.
Basically, when a company is properly registered, the law treats it as a completely distinct entity. It's separate from its owners, the shareholders.
It's not just a group of people. It is something on its own.
Precisely. It has its own legal rights and its own obligations.
And this wasn't just plucked out of thin air, right?
Okay.
There's a famous case mentioned.
That's right. It was really nailed down in the UK House of Lords case, Salomon and Salomon Limited.
Salomon Limited.
Yeah, right? Yeah. Mr. Salomon had a business, turned it into a limited company. He held most shares. And importantly, he also lent the company money, becoming a secured creditor.
So he was the main owner and a major lender to his own company.
He was. When the business unfortunately failed, other creditors, the unsecured ones, argued the company was just a sham, just Salomon in disguise. They thought they should be paid before his loan.
Makes sense from their perspective.
You can see why they'd argue that. But the court said no. They held that the company was formed correctly under the law, and once formed, it was a separate legal person.
Regardless of his motives or how much control he had.
Yes. The company's debts were its own debts, not Mr. Solomon's personal debts. And his secured loan was perfectly valid against the company's assets.
Wow. That really establishes the principle firmly. So what are the big consequences of this separate personality that the materials point out?
Well, several key things flow from it. Because it's separate, the company itself can own assets. The factory, the computers, the money in the bank, that all belongs to the company, not the shareholders directly.
Okay.
It can also make contracts in its own name. It can borrow money, incur debts, and very importantly, it can sue other people or be sued itself.
So if there's a lawsuit, it's against the company limited,
Hmm.
not necessarily the individuals behind it.
That's usually the case. And the flip side, for the members, the shareholders, is limited liability. This is a huge deal.
The limited liability aspect, that's what most people think of.
It is. It means their personal assets, their house, their savings are generally protected if the company gets into financial trouble. Their risk is usually limited to the value of their shares. Creditors typically can't go after them personally.
That really encourages investment and entrepreneurship, doesn't it? Lowers the personal risk.
Absolutely. Another point the materials mention is perpetual succession. The company keeps going even if the members change. People can sell shares, pass away. Whatever the company itself continues to exist until it's formally dissolved.
It has its own lifespan, independent of the owners.
Right. So this separation, this legal distinction, creates what's often called the veil of incorporation.
The veil.
Okay.
Like a screen between the company and the people running it.
Exactly. Normally, you deal with the company, and you don't need to look behind that veil to see who the shareholders or directors are.
But, and this seems crucial from the materials, that veil isn't absolute. It's not always respected.
No, it's definitely not impenetrable. The law recognizes that sometimes, in exceptional situations, that separation needs to be disregarded. The veil can be lifted or pierced.
Lifted or pierced. And why would the law do that? What's the goal?
The main purpose is usually to hold the people behind the company, the members or directors controlling it, responsible for what the company did or the debts it incurred.
So you ignore the separation to prevent some kind of injustice or wrongdoing.
Essentially, yes. The law won't allow the corporate structure to be used just as a device to commit fraud or avoid obligations unfairly. These exceptions come from specific laws, statutes, and also from judges developing principles through cases over time, the common law.
And our materials focus on one specific common law reason for lifting the veil, right? One that's relevant to the problem we're looking at.
Yes. A key ground is where someone uses the company structure specifically to commit or hide a fraud, or, and this is the relevant one for our example, to evade a pre-existing legal obligation.
Evading an obligation. So if you personally are legally required to do something or not do something,
You can't just set up a company and have the company do it instead, hoping the veil protects you. Courts generally won't allow that.
that makes sense. You can't just sidestep your own responsibilities using a corporate shell.
Exactly. And the materials highlight a really important case here, Guildford Motors and Horn.
Guildford Motors and Horn. Okay, how does that illustrate this evasion point?
Well, Mr. Horn was an employee, and his contract had a non-compete clause, basically. A promise not to compete with his employer for a certain time after leaving.
Pretty standard stuff in some industries.
Right. But as soon as he left, he set up a new company, basically controlled by him, to carry on a competing business. He tried to argue, hey, the non-compete applies to me, personally, not to my company, which is a separate legal entity.
He was trying to use the Salomon principle, the separate personality, as a shield.
Precisely. But the court saw right through it. They said the only reason he formed that company was to get around his personal contractual promise. It was a deliberate maneuver, a misuse of the corporate form.
So they lifted the veil.
They did. They treated Horn and his company as one and the same for the purpose of that non-compete clause. They issued an injunction in order to stop against both Mr. Horn and his company.
That's a clear message. Don't use a company just to dodge your personal promises.
Okay, so we have the core rule, separate legal personality from Salomon. We have the veil it creates. And we have this key exception. You can't use the veil to evade existing obligations, as shown in Guildford Motors.
Exactly. And now the materials present a hypothetical scenario, the case of David, Sweet Treats Limited, or STL, and his new company, David's Delights Sweet Limited, DDPL, to see how we apply these principles.
Right, the case study. Let's lay it out. David works for STL. He's a baker. His contract says he can't run a similar business within 5 kilometers for 2 years after leaving.
Standard non-compete. David then resigns, and almost immediately he incorporates DDPL. He's the sole shareholder, sole director, total control.
And guess what DDPL does?
Opens a bakery, selling similar stuff, just 1 kilometer away from STL.
Oh dear. Looks like a direct breach of his promise.
On the face of it, yes, STL obviously argues he's breaching the clause, but David's likely argument back is,
That clause was with me, David. My company, DDPL, is a separate person. It didn't sign that contract. He's hiding behind the veil. He's trying to. So the big question for STL, and for us trying to analyze this using the materials, is can they get a court to lift DDPL's corporate veil and enforce that non-compete against the company?
how do we figure that out? It feels complicated. Do the materials give us a method?
Yes, thankfully they do. They provide a structured approach, a guide for tackling exactly this kind of legal problem question. It breaks it down into logical steps.
A method to the madness.
Okay,
What's step 1 according to this guide?
step 1 is identify the issue. You have to state clearly what the central legal problem is. The guide stresses you should name the key legal concepts involved right away.
So for David, the clash is between separate legal personality, which he's relying on,
And lifting the corporate veil, which STL wants to achieve, specifically on the grounds of evading an obligation.
right. So the issue is something like, is David improperly using DDPL's separate status to get around his personal non-compete duty, and can the court lift the veil because of this evasion?
Perfect. You framed the legal contest. That's the core issue.
Okay, issue identified. What's step 2 in the guide?
Step 2, state the rule. Now you lay out the relevant legal principles. Start general, then get specific.
So we'd start with the big one, separate legal personality.
Exactly. Mention the doctrine, cite Salomon and Salomon Limited as the authority. Briefly explain its effect, like limited liability, the very thing David's hoping benefits him here.
Then we introduce the but.
Yes. Then you explain that this principle isn't absolute. The veil can be lifted in exceptional cases to prevent abuse.
And zero in on the specific abuse relevant here.
Precisely. State the specific ground, using the corporate form to evade a pre-existing legal obligation. And crucially, you need to mention the supporting case law provided in the materials Guildford Motors and Horn.
And maybe briefly explain what happened in Guildford.
Yes, briefly outline the facts.
Yeah.
The employee, the non-compete, setting up the company to avoid it, and the outcome. The court lifted the veil because it was clearly evasion. You're showing, the general rule, the specific exception, and a key case that illustrates it.
Got it. Step 1. Issue SLP versus veil lifting for evasion. Step 2. Rule. SLP Salmon, Veil Concept, Evasion Exception, Guilford Case. What's next? Step 3.
Step 3 is apply the rule to the facts. This is where the rubber meets the road. You connect the law you just stated to the specific details of David's situation.
This is where we argue why David's actions fit the evasion pattern.
Exactly. You analyze what David did. He had a personal non-compete obligation before he set up the company. You highlight the timing, setting up BDPL right after leaving STL. You note his complete control, sole shareholder and director, and you point out that DDPL immediately started the competing business within the restricted zone.
The facts seem to line up pretty closely with the Guilford Motors case, don't they?
They really do, and you make that connection explicit. You argue that these facts strongly suggest David's primary motive for creating DDPL was to circumvent his personal agreement. It wasn't just some unrelated new venture.
You're building the case that this is an evasion attempt.
Yes. You draw the analogy to Guilford Motors directly. Look at the similarities. Employee, non-compete, leaves, sets up a controlled company, company competes. You argue that David's use of DDPL seems, using the kind of language in the materials, like an improper use of the corporate structure to conceal his actions and evade his personal obligations.
So you're demonstrating how the specific facts of David's case trigger the legal exception established in cases like Guilford.
That's precisely the goal of the application step. You show why the court should, based on these facts and the established legal principle, disregard DDPL's separate personality in this context.
Okay, makes sense. Issue, rule, application. That must lead to the final step.
Step 4. Reach a conclusion. Based on your analysis in Step 3, you now provide a clear answer to the issue you identified back in Step 1.
So answer the question, can STL likely enforce the clause against DDPL?
Yes. You state the probable outcome. Given the strong parallels to Guilford and the evidence of evasion, you'd likely conclude that a court would probably lift the corporate veil here.
And what does lifting the veil actually mean in practice for David and DDPL?
You need to explain that consequence. It means the court would treat David and DDPL as effectively the same entity for the purpose of this non-compete clause. The separation is ignored for this specific issue.
So the promise David made personally now attaches to the company he set up to avoid it.
That's the effect. And you should state the likely remedy, again, mirroring Guilford. The court would probably grant an injunction stopping both David and DDPL from running the competing bakery. Your conclusion needs to be consistent with your application.
That IRS method issue, rule, application, conclusion really does give you a clear path through the problem.
It does. It ensures you cover the necessary legal ground in a logical order, using the facts effectively.
So recapping our deep dive today, we started with the fundamental power of separate legal personality, the Salomon principle, and the veil it creates.
But we saw it's not absolute. The law steps in when that corporate form is misused, particularly, as we saw, to evade existing legal duties, like in the Guilford Motors case.
And the key skill we explored was using that structured method issue, rule, application, conclusion, to analyze a scenario like David's, connecting the facts to the legal principles.
It's a versatile framework for legal analysis.
I think the big takeaway is that while forming a company offers huge advantages, especially limited liability, you can't just use it as a magic trick to disappear your personal responsibilities. The law has limits.
It's always about balancing the utility of the corporate form against the potential for its abuse.
So here's something to think about after this. Using this IRS method and the principle from Guilford, how might you analyze other situations? What if someone set up a company to try and avoid, say, paying a personal debt they'd guaranteed? Or maybe to get around a confidentiality agreement they signed personally? Could this evasion principle apply? It's worth considering how this framework helps you dissect those kinds of problems, too.
That's a great thought exercise. Applying the method is key.
Happy studying. Until the next class.